Good afternoon. Today I would like to talk about how, in the ancient times, a North African army had crossed the Alps, and it was the first army to do so. Presently, that region of North Africa is largely composed of the present country Tunisia. At that time, the region was called Carthage. So the the troops of Carthage, led by a general called Hannibal Barca, wanted to conquer Rome. The, and Rome at that time had a very strong navy. But when it came to protecting its land area or the northern frontier of Rome, it was not that strong. And therefore, the army of Carthage under Hannibal Barca wanted to exploit this, take this as an advantage, and advance forward to this northern frontier, which composed of the Alps mountains. So right now, I will talk about how this army had crossed the Alps. It was a very difficult thing to do at that time, and I will quickly get into the story. I would like to take you back to 218 BC. At 218 BC, the troops of Carthage had started from southern Spain, and then they're going to advance forward and then cross the Alps, reach the plains of Italy, and then they would fight the battle. So at southern Spain, they would be traveling. They would be traveling, and they would be moving along the banks of a large river, a river called Rhone River. Rhone River right now crosses two countries, that is Switzerland and France. Uh, so, uh, so while they were doing so, at one point they also had to cross the river. And let me describe what all happened while they crossed the river. Firstly, a majority of the troops found it difficult to cross the river. They had to make some makeshift boat-like objects. And one boat-like object was a narrow, light boat which had pointed ends called canoes. And the other was a buoyant object, a flat object made of a timber tied together called rafts. So all these were makeshift canoes and makeshift rafts, and majority of the army actually moved on this and crossed the river. And let me tell you, there were the strength of the army was 400,000, and in addition there were some elephants also. There were 37 elephants. So all this elephants and army and horses had to cross. Next, there were some few people, lucky people, who were ferried through across the river by a kind boatman. And next, it was the turn of the horses. Horses would follow suit. They would swim and follow suit. But the difficult part was getting the elephants to move. Elephants would not come in close proximity to water. They feared water. What did Carthaginian troops do about it? What did Hannibal Barca do about it? He had instructed his engineers to tie a raft to the edge of the bank of the river, on the river. And then there would be some earth that would be poured on that raft, and the elephants would then interpret it as some kind of land, and they would hop on that. And once they would do so, the attachment of the raft with the bank would be cut, and then the raft would move on the river. So they did precisely that. The plan didn't exactly work out, but the elephants had hopped on or went on the raft. But as soon as the raft started moving on the water, the elephants started to panic. So there was an occasion when one of the rafts carrying a lot of elephants had upturned, and the elephants would fall into the river with a splash in their trumpeting voice. But nevertheless, these elephants would wade across the river ultimately and reach the other end of the bank. So after the so after the troops had reach the other end of the bank, Hannibal Barca would give his troops some rest, because the next day they had to climb a section of the Alps, they had to climb a mountain range in the Alps, and they had to march around 400 kilometers. And not only that, the journey is going to be quite difficult because it's going to be quite foggy, it's going to rain, and then the mountains are really steep, and no army had ever crossed the Alps before them, and therefore it's going to be difficult. But nevertheless, the Carthaginian army took up the challenge. They started moving through this section of Alps in a certain mountain range. They had their own difficulties, as I already mentioned, but there was also another difficulty. There were some local guides who accompanied these troops, and these local guides colluded with the allies of the Romans, called Gauls, and they allied with these Gauls and led these Carthaginian armies towards a trap. And what was this trap? So at one point, the Carthaginian army was at a deep valley called a gorge, and a gorge is typically characterized by its steep hills on either side. They were at a gorge. So at one point there was this steep hill on one part, and there was a deep valley on the other side, and the troops were in the middle. And they were at a very narrow region as well. So the trap was the Gauls would come and attack the army from behind. Not only that, the Gauls would also roll certain stones from the top of a certain region on the mountain towards the Carthaginian army. So the Carthaginian armies did not have anywhere to go. They did not have anywhere to hide. They could not go forward, they could not go backward, and on the top of that, these horses, they were just slowly moving backward, and the horses behind those horses would fall into the deep ravine or the valley and die. So they were completely trapped at this point. So next, despite these obstacles, the Carthaginian army would ultimately come out victorious against the Gauls. They would not only fend off the attack from the Gauls, they would also drive them away. The Gauls would ultimately be driven. I won't go into the details as to how they were driven. They were driven off. Next is 9 days have passed since they started this journey through this mountain range, and they were within the sight of a certain mountain, a low mountain having a mountain pass. And I told you it was foggy, but the mist had briefly cleared at that pass, and they were able to see the plains of Italy. At this time, Hannibal Barca would point in the direction of plains of Italy, and he would tell his troops that it's a matter of battle or two before they would conquer Rome, and this would greatly enthuse the soldiers amidst all the difficulties they faced while moving through the Alps. But the difficulties would not stop after this. So next is they had to move down the mountain. The region was quite snowy, so it was quite difficult to move through the snowy region. It was also difficult for the animals like horses to graze because of the snow. And on the top of that, there was a landslide that would ensure that a certain boulder would block their way. So their path was not clear. Snow plus the boulder. So what did they do about the boulder? They had set it on fire. Firstly, they put some wood and then let the rock or the boulder burn to become red or red hot. and then they would pour some vinegar, and ultimately the rock would break up into small pieces, and now the path was clear. After 2 weeks after they started their journey through the Alps, they would lose, the Carthaginian army would lose majority of their troops, majority of 400,000 troops. And after crossing the Alps also, the elephants did survive, but when they were making the journey towards the Italian plains, the chill, the winter of the Italian plains had caused all the elephants but one to perish. And on that one, Hannibal Barca would advance forward towards the Italian plain. And with very few soldiers, he would fight a battle against the Romans. On 216 BC, at the Battle of Cannae, the Carthaginian army defeats the Roman army and takes over Rome. I told you that the journey began on 218 BC and the battle happened in 216 BC, called the Battle of Cannae. Hannibal would stay in Rome for 15 years, and his entire stay was fraught with difficulties. The Romans were continually after him. Ultimately, he wouldn't defeat the Romans in these 15 years, and he had to return back to North Africa by sea, this time by sea. So he had traveled through land. Firstly, to reach the Italian plains, he traveled through South Spain, he traveled through France, he traveled through the Alps, and then reached the Italian plain, and ultimately in 203 BC he would return by sea to North Africa. So this is the video about how the Carthaginian army a North African army for the first time had crossed the Alps. I hope I was able to shed some light on the difficulties that the army had faced to cross the Alps, and also shed some light on the battle that they fought, the Battle of Cannae. So thank you very much.